Well, let's get started then. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rick Rinehart, Deputy Director at CPWR, the Center for Construction Research and Training. And I'd like to welcome you today to today's webinar reviewing CPWR and Dodge Data and Analytics SmartMarket Report, Safety Management in the Construction Industry 2021. We are very fortunate today to have Dr. Donna Laquidara-Carr to summarize the findings in this latest report, which is part of a series of collaborative efforts between CPWR and Dodge. But before I introduce Donna and the series, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on cpwr.com/webinars. It will also be shared in a follow-up email with everyone who registered. Our host, Jessica Bunting, will drop that link in the chat along with other relevant information or links throughout the webinar. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can also reach out to her there. Should you lose audio at any point, please call in using your phone instead. All attendees are automatically muted for the duration of the event, but please feel free to type in any questions in the Q&A or chat at any time. We received some questions during the registration and we'll do our best to get through those and then any live questions that come in. With that, I'd like to formally introduce Donna. Next slide, Donna. She's been with Dodge for over 25 years and became the managing editor of the SmartMarket Report series in 2010. She has worked collaboratively with CPWR since the first SmartMarket report we did together in 2012 and published in 2013. Next slide. And as you can see in the slide, there were 4 previous studies before this one with support from CPWR and each resulting in a SmartMarket report. And these are available on our website and also on Dodge's website, which I think Donna will talk about that in a minute. The intent of these studies are really to get a pulse of what the industry is thinking in a snapshot in time in regards to safety management and practices. And it is interesting, now that we've done several of these over the years, and we try to do them once every 2 years, just to see how things evolve. So we're excited to have her here today to talk about the findings from the latest study that was just published and how safety practices have changed or stayed the same over time. So Donna, thank you for joining, and I will hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Rick. So before I dive in and explain the results of the study, I did want to make sure that everyone on the call is familiar with Dodge. Odds are you all are. We've been around for a long, long time, but our capabilities keep expanding. And right now we divide those up into the 3 categories you see on the slide. The work that I do, though, is often less associated with Dodge. It's in the accelerate category, and it's understanding the market better. And we do that through market research. And this study is an example of the kind of research we perform out in the industry. And as Rick mentioned, the findings of the study we're about to go through are published in the SmartMarket report. We actually have many dozens of different reports that we have published on our website. And the great thing about this is that we always work with industry partners to do these studies. So, that allows us to be able to offer them for free to the industry. So you see the website at the top of the slide right now, construction.com/toolkit/reports. That's where you can go to download reports on any of the topics, any of the ones you see here, or many, many more. So I do encourage you, since even though this will be a rather thorough review of the data in the report, there's still a lot more to the report than we'll be able to discuss here. So I did want to kind of go, before we actually look at the findings, discuss the methodology of the report. So for this particular one, we did an online survey as we've done in the past. It was conducted from May 11th to June 25th. We landed up with 282 contractors who participated. Our primary source of contractors who participated was our own unique Dodge Data and Analytics contractor panel, which includes a mix of prime contractors and specialty trade contractors. In addition to that, we were fortunate enough to work with several wonderful industry partners who distributed the survey to their members. You see them listed on the slide. I really do want to thank all of them for their participation in this. We really think that getting the industry engaged is incredibly valuable. Also, in addition to CPWR, before I move on from this slide, if you look at the cover of the report, I do also want to call out that our other financial sponsor, the other group that was able to help us bring this data to you, was Numetrics. So they were an important part of this study. So as I said, we had, a number of contractors reply. Interestingly, and for the first time ever, it was evenly split between prime contractors, GCs, construction managers and design builders, and specialty trade contractors. We always go for a balance between the two, but I don't think we've ever had such a precise even split before. We had a very good mix of participation too by company size. And you'll see, and throughout the presentation, we're going to come back to looking at the data through the perspective of large, mid-size, and small companies again and again. And when we refer to large, mid-size, and small companies, it will be based on these ratios, that a small company is fewer than 20 employees, mid-size has fewer than 20 or more, but less than 100 employees. And then the large companies are those with 100 employees or more. As I mentioned, there's a lot in the SmartMarket report we are not going to cover at all. One of the things that we're not going to really discuss today, because we're going to focus on the data we gathered, are the sidebar articles. But they're really, we have some really interesting things that I encourage you to take a look at if you download the report on the psychology of safety, using a data-driven approach for safety, trends in safety training. We always do some data on safety training, and this gives you an idea of things that the industry is doing to promote its safety training, and the Prevention Through Design National Initiative, which we're really excited about and hoping to keep track of in the future. I am actually in this presentation going to briefly touch on the case studies we performed. And we also have a thought leader who really talks about how health and safety go together in the industry. All right, so let's dive into the data itself, though. And one of the things that's been consistent in all the reports that we've done is that we've always looked at safety practices. What's the industry actually doing? Now, you see there's a lot of stuff on this slide that I've just turned to. So we're not going to touch on everything in great detail, but I want to make sure as we go through these slides, because I have several that look like this, that you understand how to read them. So the top bar, the darkest bar, is the total respondents. So with the safety practices in particular, we want to give you a sense of just what the level of adoption is across the industry, regardless of size of contractor. And that is represented by those dark blue bars. The 3 bars below it are by company size. So, and so one of the things, and these particular practices that you're looking at on this slide have to do with the project or the site, and what type of safety practices are being employed there. Now, one of the things you'll very quickly notice is that there's a distinct pattern that large companies are doing most of these practices really quite frequently, and smaller companies are doing them less frequently. Now, when it comes to something like site-specific safety and health plans, the most widely used of all of these project or site-related practices, there's a pretty high percentage across the board who are participating in those. But even where we see a high percentage of small companies, 60% in this case, who have adopted these practices, it's still not quite as common as it is amongst the large companies, where we see 88%. And you see that the gap between large and small companies does grow, with a few really notable ones where the gap is quite large. And of course, we do understand And you know, a key part of this is not to say, oh, small contractors should be doing more, but to think about ways that the industry can help small contractors do more because they don't necessarily have the resources that a larger company does. But nonetheless, there are a few things, like for instance, giving employees stop work authority, where perhaps this isn't something that's necessarily resource driven, and that smaller companies could perhaps more widely adopt. We also see a measurable safety goals and objectives as with a huge gap between how common they are among large companies and how common they are among smaller companies. And there really does feel like there's ways in which the industry overall could more widely adopt these practices. All right, so those are the safety practices related to the project site. Now let's look at the organizational practices to promote safety. Again, we see the same pattern emerging, where even amongst those that are widely adopted, and certainly maintaining an open door policy to workers to report hazards, incidents, and concerns is fortunately very widely adopted in the industry, with even over 3/4 of the small companies engaging in this practice. But even there, we still see a gap between adoption by large and small companies. And again, we see that same pattern where the gap grows as you go down the list and off to the right. One thing that I do want to point out to you in this data, as I said, we've been asking about safety practices since we first launched the survey, and we've been asking about most of them in this way for the last 3 studies. So I don't have the findings for you on this because while there are small shifts, there were no huge trends in terms of adoption. Adoption has remained pretty steady on most of these. But on this particular survey this time, we changed the wording a little bit for the option highlighted in red. It used to just say involve frontline workers in safety. This year, we switched it to involve frontline workers in safety planning. And you'll notice that this one finishes second to last, and it's only adopted across the industry by 56%. Although we see that the gaps are actually smaller between large and small companies in terms of engaging in this. Interestingly, that if you asked, when we asked in the past about whether you involve your frontline workers in safety, it was always one of the top measures. But when we added in safety planning, it went way, way down. And this does suggest that while it's common to just think about engaging frontline workers when the project's underway and making sure that safety is maintained, when it comes to really drawing upon their expertise and getting that into your safety programs, that is still something that appears to be emerging in the industry. So that was kind of an interesting finding from one year to the next. All right, so the previous 2 slides have been about what are you doing? What are you actually implementing on your projects? This particular list of safety practices are not what they're actually doing. In this case, we said to them, you know, regardless of what you're doing, what do you think are the most critical elements for a company to have a world-class safety program? And you see that the gaps are actually a little bit smaller here in many cases between large and small companies, but they still persist, which suggests that larger companies do see a need for more safety practices for a really outstanding safety program compared to smaller companies. Again, you know, we have always asked this in the past. Most of the findings are pretty similar to what we've seen in the past. You can see job site worker involvement is one of the top 3. We also see factors involving supervisors and job site workers often finish at the top of this list. So, you know, really when people, there's almost universal agreement that when it comes to a world-class safety program, getting the supervisors and the job site workers engaged and active, doing regular meetings, showing strong leadership skills, all of these are really well understood to be critical to a world-class safety program. I do, before we leave this piece of data though, want to call your attention to the 2 last options. This is the first time that we've asked about these 2. And this was part of a larger push to begin looking at data-driven safety in these studies. So this was the initial benchmark for the degree to which the industry recognizes and values data-driven safety. And there were two elements of the world-class safety program we asked them to consider. Use of observation data from job site imagery and use of predictive analytics. You can see that by far these are the least widely adopted right now. This is truly an emerging area. We do see, especially when it comes to observation data from job site imagery, wider interest in them and wider expectation that they're truly important from large companies than from small companies. But generally, we think this is a great starting point, and we'll be interested to see if they stay here or if they evolve as we continue doing these studies every 2 years. Also, in regards to the attempt to look at data-driven safety, we asked a new question in this section. We asked about the ways to improve safety programs. And I apologize, we have a little formatting issue, but the little yellow circle should say over 90%. And it's over 90% who believe that at least one approach would be helpful out of all the ones we asked about. Now, some of these don't seem to directly reference safety data, but they all do have to do with either how one uses data to manage safety or the direct gathering of it. And, so there's wide recognition in the industry. They had the option that you see in the red box above, that they could say, yeah, none of these would be particularly helpful, but no, over 90% recognized that that some of these would be pretty helpful. But we see some real differences in terms of what large companies think will improve safety programs versus small. With large companies, you'll note that the three options on the left have a standardized process for safety across all projects, identify project elements most at risk of a safety incident in the next week, and make better use of the project and safety data we already collect. All three of these are pretty much equally valued. The difference between 31%, 32%, and 28% is not very large. They're all selected by about a third of the large companies as ways that they think that would improve their safety programs. However, when you look at mid-sized and small companies, you see that they really put a big emphasis on having a standardized process for safety across all projects. They're, over 40% in each case of mid-sized and small companies said that, yes, we think this would be a major improvement. And this is in contrast to the other two options, which were selected by significantly fewer. So there is a bit of a difference there by size in terms of what they're thinking of for improving their safety programs. Next, we're going to take a look at the impacts of safety programs. So again, this is something that we've asked about consistently since we launched this survey. And we asked about a very large list of potential benefits of safety. You see the list of options on the chart on this page. We asked them to rate these on a 5-point scale, from a very positive impact all the way through to a very negative impact, with no impact in the middle. So this chart represents, the 5s and the 4s, the positive and very positive impacts are in the green sections of the bars. The blue section represents those who felt there was no impact at all. And the gray represents those who felt that there was a negative impact on their companies based on their company's safety programs. So there's a few immediate trends that you'll note. There's pretty much wide agreement that most contractors feel that their safety programs provide a positive benefit in terms of their ability to negotiate better insurance terms, their willingness of job site workers to report unsafe work conditions, their standing in the industry, and their recordable injury rates. And a very high percentage see, about 2/3 see positive impacts in terms of the ability to bring in new work, a real strong business benefit there. The performance of a trade partner, many see as really positively impacted by their safety programs, and worker retention and project quality also perform very strongly. So, and again, I don't have the findings comparing this with the previous study because this is pretty consistent with the findings we've seen all along. Now, you will notice that there's a little bit more gray on the last two with project budget and project schedule. Still, I want you to pay attention to the fact that the green bars are twice as big or more than the gray bars in each. So far more contractors see a positive impact on their budgets and schedules from their safety program than those who report a negative impact. We also did do a comparison of the impacts of these safety programs by the size of the companies. Not surprisingly, we see large companies really see the benefits of safety. As you saw, they were using a lot more safety practices pretty consistently across the board, both in their organization and on site. And the payoff appears to be that many, many more of them report positive impacts on their everything from their standing in the industry to the willingness of job site workers to report unsafe work conditions, to that ability to bring in new work, to the ability to attract new workers and retain employees. So, and in this environment right now, those attract new workers and retain the ones you have are becoming more and more critical business factors. All right, and before we leave the impacts of safety, I thought this was a good time to share one of the three safety case studies we had with you. So we were able to feature a very large tech office building in San Francisco. The tech company did not release the ability to say who they are, but this was a 1.8 million square foot project with over or around 1,000 workers on site at any one time at the peak of construction. They used lean methodologies to try to manage safety as well as many other things on the project. And actually, the case study is from the perspective not of the general contractor, but of one of the trade contractors, Southland, who was involved in this, a mechanical contractor. The lean methods that were deployed on this project led them to 3 years plus 180 days without a recordable safety incident. And in fact, when they saw that date approaching, after 3 years had gone by and, well over many, many days after that, and they still hadn't had a recordable safety incident, they planned a big lunch celebration. You can see the image of the workers celebrating the fact that they were able to do this so safely. And they credited, some of the key things they credited for that strong safety performance were their daily huddles and their Gemba walks, which involves people at all different levels of the project walking the site together with all the trades. And the gentleman who we interviewed, Henry Nutt III from Southland, pointed out that lean construction forces people to say, I can do it alone, but I can't do it better alone. I need the person next to me. It's that ability, especially with such a massive project, to be able to coordinate effectively that really made lean have an impact on safety. All right, so let's move on to training and the data we've seen in training. Now that we've looked at what people are doing and the impacts they've seen from it, let's see how they're encouraging their workers to be safer through training. We did take a very different approach to training this year. So we did try to look at it in a new way. We've always had a training section, but we had a lot of new questions on it this time, and I think some of them were fascinating. The first one is, again, just like with the safety practices, we want to understand, well, what kind of training is being offered? We've never actually looked at that before. So we asked them two questions. First, we just said, what are you currently offering to your workers, in terms of safety training? And then we said, what do you think, regardless of whether you offer it or not, is needed most? Now, the currently offered, they could just select everything that was applicable. But with what they needed most, they were only asked to select the top 3. So you cannot gauge it from the space between the green bars and the blue bars, right? Because if you could only select the top 3, they might have felt that all of this training was needed on their projects. But with the needed part, we just wanted to get at, where's your biggest priorities? Where do you think the most essential training lies? So it's not so much the gap between the green and the blue, but the way in which the green and the blue correspond. And to make that a little bit clearer in terms of, which are the largest and which are the smallest generally. And, to make that a little bit clearer, instead of sorting these by the green bars, we sorted it by the blue bars. So if you look at this, both of these sides of the charts, they're in order, they're in descending order based on the share who selected each of these in their top 3 as needed the most. And one of the things that's heartening about this particular slide is that the things that are offered the most, fall protection, PPE equipment training, are also recognized pretty widely as needed the most. So that's great. There's good industry alignment between what's being offered and what's needed. That was very satisfying. Where we see some potential gaps is when we see things like first aid, CPR, AED. It's a pretty high performance, 4th in terms of what's needed, but it actually scores a bit lower in terms of what's currently offered. So there is a suggestion where perhaps the industry could provide a little bit more training in that area to help address that gap. Another one is the lifting and ergonomics. Again, it's a slightly higher share of those who need it, who feel it's in the top 3 that's needed in terms of its overall ranking, than the share who are actually offering it at this point. And again, we did look at the offerings by size of company, and the only ones I'm showing you here are the ones with the biggest gaps, where again we see that one with that little bit of a gap, the first 2, the 2 I pointed to as maybe perhaps more needed than offered, are in fact frequently offered by large companies and far less frequently offered by small companies. And we also see that's true of hazard communication, of training on confined spaces, and of emergency response and planning. All right, we did ask about the frequency of training, but that data is a little bit complicated to go through in a webinar. After we asked about the frequency of training, we said, okay, we asked you about the type of training you offered. We asked about the frequency with which you offer it. What are the biggest factors that influence what type of training and the frequency with which it is offered? We didn't ask them separately. We asked them as one question. Basically, what influences you most as you're setting up your training program? And we could see that one response, they had to just choose a top 3, but one response clearly dominated with well over half, 62%, selecting it in their top 3, which is specific job site conditions and needs. And that is pretty consistent with findings we've seen in the past that demonstrate that it's really the specific job sites that often drive practices and training. Second to that is meeting OSHA standards, which was selected by 44%, which for a top 3 selection is still a pretty strong representation. And the third biggest one was the need to stay current on new regulations. Everything else kind of, I also do want to point to 31% saying that it's experience level of the workers that's really important, with, again, the issues that they are having attracting skilled labor right now, the challenges that contractors are facing. I think this will be an interesting one to keep an eye on to see if it stays about the same, which is already a pretty important influential factor in determining the types of training that companies offer, or if it even becomes more substantial. We also wanted to understand online training, and while we've looked at online training in the past, we did revamp the way we asked the question slightly. So unfortunately, that does mean we can't compare to the last findings, but we did feel we wanted a slightly better understanding of exactly what kind of online training, how frequently online training is being used. So first, we just asked that, how frequently do you use online training? About nearly 2/3, 63%, say that right now they're using online training, and about 1/3 said they're not. When we take that 63% and say, okay, do you say you're using online training now? remember that this was conducted so that, it was a full year of the pandemic that had been in place before we did this. Have you increased the use of online training in the last 12 months? So the second pie is not a representation of all the participants in the study. It's just a representation of how that 63% in the first pie break out. And amongst those who are using training, 35% reported that they increased it in the last 12 months, that they increased its use. So, a notable share of everyone who's doing online training did see an increase in the last month. Then we asked those 35% about the degree to which COVID influenced their increase in training. We actually offered them more options that I'm showing you here. If you do end up downloading the report, you can see more details on this. But 77% reported that COVID-19 did influence their increase in training. Some of them said that it was the reason they increased or even introduced online training. Some of them said that they were already planning to use online training or already planning to increase their use of it, but they did it a little bit more or a little bit quicker because of their response to COVID-19. When going back to that 63% who you said they're using online training now, we wanted to understand, well, is this, has the industry topped off on its use of online training? After all, there was a big encouragement, right, with the pandemic to use it now. If you're not using it now, how likely are you to use it? So we asked both those who are using it and those who are not using it if they plan to increase it to understand it better. Among the current users, 41% plan to increase its use in the next 3 years. So we do see that contractors still do not believe, those who are using it do not believe they've tapped its full potential. Many, many more think that they'll be using it more intensively in the future. When we ask the 33% if they are planning on using it in the next 3 years, about 1/4 of them said that they are. So, we're not seeing a huge amount of growth in terms of overall users. But, in theory, if a bunch of them do follow through on that, we'll see that 63% grow a little bit the next time we look at this. All right, we also wanted to see what they would select as the best means to enhance safety training. And again, this was, they could say that it wouldn't help at all, it would somewhat enhance, or it would significantly enhance. If we added the wouldn't help at all, that would bring these bars all to 100%. But right now, we just chose to focus on showing you those who said that each of these means would somewhat enhance or significantly enhance their safety training. One thing that's interesting is that when it comes to just the significantly enhanced, the responses are pretty much the same across the board. The differences are too tiny to really be notable between task-specific training materials used to enhance safety, information on emerging hazards to enhance safety, resources to conduct online training, and toolbox talks. However, when you include those who felt it would somewhat enhance it, we can see that there is a larger share of the respondents, of the contractors, felt that having task-specific training materials was really the top means to enhance safety. And close behind that was information on emerging hazards. We've always seen some importance placed on toolbox talks in all of our previous studies. In fact, we did not include a question on which are the most useful ways to get safety messages out to the field because toolbox talks had just been so consistently the top means. So we sort of took that as a given in this survey and said, okay, you love toolbox talks. Where do you get them from? So we wanted to understand what are their best resources for getting toolbox talks. And a lot of them are creating them themselves. About half say that they are creating their own toolbox talks. So there's clearly some appetite, perhaps, for more industry resources that can provide them with what they need. OSHA is also a very big source of toolbox talks information. Contractor associations are drawn upon by a lot of different respondents. And then we see about a third say insurance companies, and about a quarter say that they're getting toolbox talks from suppliers, vendors, or manufacturers. Now, finally, the last data point that we had in this training section is about the Foundations for Safety Leadership Training. And we really were just trying to understand its use over time. So it was introduced in 2017, and when we did the survey in 2017, it had been out for about 6 to 8 months. And about 40% said that they had used it in that survey. By 2019, we saw that creep up slightly to 43%. And in 2021, we still see a little bit of growth with 45% who say that they are in fact using Foundations for Safety Leadership Training. There was a bigger share, though, in 2021 who weren't sure about whether they were using it or not, which may suggest that there is a need for further education in the industry about the availability of this training. Then finally, to wrap up the training section in this presentation, we did feature a case study that was about an organization, KHS&S Contractors, and how they were trying to take a very different approach to safety. They wanted to try employing visual management to better manage their safety programs. They felt like having a safety manual, as valuable as that is, and they certainly weren't proposing getting rid of the safety manual, but they felt that relying on a safety manual for workers was not productive, that this was not the best way to necessarily get safety messages from the organization out to the field. So they felt that there was a more visual way to do that, and they created a series of icons and symbols for hazards and work conditions. And they add them at times to the drawings to say, here's a hazard to look out for, specifically, so that someone quickly looking at the drawings would know the things that they need to bear in mind when it comes to safety. And they also use them on their helmets to indicate what kind of safety training that they've had. So when you look at this image, those stickers all over the helmets are not just decoration. They are meaningful representations about what they've actually done and what kind of hazards they've been trained for. So it becomes very easy for a supervisor to pick, who to put in what sections, because he can quickly see who has the proper training to deal with the hazards they're likely to encounter there. Another key part of this program was that it's an ongoing program and that they're constantly getting feedback from workers. They'll let them know if the icon doesn't seem intuitive. They want people to be able to look at these stickers, not have to memorize a whole new set of information, but to really just look at the stickers, and just from what the sticker shows, be quickly prompted that this must be this kind of hazard. And they said their first set were dreadful. They said that when they brought out the first set of icons, they really didn't match up that well. And the workers let them know that. And, they also reported, since they've introduced this, consistent decreases in both incidents and injuries on their site. And the gentleman who was interviewed for this case study said, how do we know this program is working? Because our employees tell us. They literally tell us. All right. We also wanted to examine technology. And again, part of this was looking at data-driven safety, and part of this is to better understand what's being in use on the job site. And again, we did change the survey a bit from what we've done in the past, which had one negative effect, which is that we can't benchmark against our previous findings. But we are able to really understand with the technologies what's in use. And I think this is a more productive way, surprisingly enough, to look at safe technology and safety, because we often find in other studies we've done at Dodge where we've looked at technology adoption, not from the perspective of safety, but included improved safety as one of the ways of measuring the effectiveness of the technology, that it's those who really are strong, sophisticated use of many technologies. BIM is a great example of this. We've seen this in multiple studies on BIM. It's those who've been using BIM for a long time or use it very intensively on projects who report that they see major safety improvements based on their use of BIM. This means that BIM can be utilized for this, but it isn't necessarily, you need a certain level of sophistication with the tools in order to really get to the point where you understand how to use it and how to measure its use in a way that you know it's impacting safety. So understanding overall technology use and then seeing how they're applying it to safety may be a far more productive way of understanding the way that technology will eventually be able to move the needle on safety than just a what are you using right now to improve safety on projects. So we found that we asked about a lot of technologies, and we found that most of them fell into 3 different categories. The ones that were used by about a third or more of all the contractors in the study, we said were established technologies. These included BIM, drones, and laser scanning. And you can see the percentages in the blue parts of those bars represent the share of contractors who are actually right now employing these on their projects. So the little green sections on each of these are those who aren't using it now, but think that they will be in the next 3 years. So one of the things you'll note is that, yes, there's pretty wide use of all these technologies, but there's also a sense that these technologies perhaps are not entirely poised for growth, that only a small share who are not using them now really are seriously considering using them in the next 3 years. On the other hand, when we look at the 4 maturing technologies, they're all used by between 10 and 14%, right? A pretty small share of the overall marketplace. But look at the percentages who think they might be using them in the future. Now, we do not expect that if we do a survey in 3 years that, you know, those who are using wearable sensors will shoot up from 11% to 27%. We often find that when we do this kind of survey, when we ask about anticipated use in the future, companies are very optimistic about their use in the future. But still, it does suggest that you will see some growth in a lot of these technologies, that there's a lot of engagement, a lot of interest, and a lot of expectation that these technologies could be useful and that they're paying attention to them. And in that sense, those big green sections on those bars are very relevant. In addition to that, another way to look at what might be the maturing technologies that are really taking hold in the industry is, okay, among that very small share, those 10% who are using them now, and across the board for all the technologies, we said, okay, you said you're using this technology now. On what percentage of your projects are you using it? Those who use predictive analytics use it on average on 52% of their projects. And those who use virtual reality for training use it on average on 33% of their projects. That intensity of use, especially for predictive analytics, I have to tell you that the predictive analytics, that level of use amongst the users was on par with the level of use of BIM, which was the highest in the study. So that very high intensity of use by those who have adopted the technology suggests that A, it is very useful, B, it's scalable. So, you know, this could lead to much wider growth in these technologies in the future. So out of these maturing ones, those are the 2 that it appears that are most likely something that people should keep their eye on. In addition to that, we asked about we asked about a few other technologies that were used by less than 10%. The ones you see here are the ones that were used by between 5 and 10%. There are several technologies that were used by less than 5%, but we didn't really feature them in the report because they're still the adoption is too low to really quite pay attention yet. But we have that data in case it grows in the next couple of years. So out of these 4 emerging technologies, 3D printing, photogrammetry, visual monitoring with AI, and augmented reality, again, we think that it might be worth keeping a close eye on visual monitoring with AI. Only, you know, about 3-4% are using it now, but 9% of the other respondents expect to use it within 3 years. So again, if you compare the percentage who are using it now to how many expect to use it, you can see there's a very high level of interest in the industry in it. And yes, it's a very tiny sample, but among theirs, nearly half of all the users who use visual monitoring with AI use it frequently or very frequently on their projects. So again, two cues that perhaps visual monitoring with AI is a growth technology to keep your eye on. So this is all about the use of technology, but as I said, we didn't ask about the use of technology for safety. Therefore, we thought it would be useful to understand, out of all these technologies that we asked them about, which ones they thought would most positively impact health and safety. And again, they had to choose them in the top 3. So they might have thought all of them could be useful for health and safety, but we really wanted to distinguish the ones that could really move the needle for safety. And it turns out that there are 2, all of these are strong scores. So all the 6 listed here are important, but there are 2 that really emerge at the top, which is wearable sensors and virtual reality for training. Although I do want to note that the visual monitoring with AI and predictive analytics, as ones that are still very emerging, are maturing, are in fact included amongst the top ones that could have a positive impact on safety. We were trying to better understand data and safety programs and the degree to which the industry is currently using data and the potential for it to use data in the future. What we saw in terms of data use is not surprising. This first set of circles represents either the companies who said they're not using data at all for safety, or they collect a lot of safety data, but then they don't end up using it in any way. And you can see that there's definitely far more small companies that fit into this category than mid-size or large companies. And even among large companies, 30% are either not gathering data at all or aren't using it very much. However, when we look at the rest, and we don't show it by the percentages by the total respondents, but just show it by who's left over. So the small companies set of bars is only that 28% who didn't fall into that first circle, and you know, the 49% of the mid-size companies and the 70% of the large companies. But when we look at how they're using safety, we asked them about 3 different ways that they could be using data to improve safety, because they said they are, right? They could use data to create visual insights to explain what's already happened. And that's a good standard approach. They could conduct analytics using trends, sorry about the typo, of what has occurred to provide signals of what may occur, or they could be using predictive analytics. You can see predictive analytics not widely adopted by anyone yet. We'll see if that changes in the future. But I want to point to the other 2, because certainly the ones in the yellowish color bars is a slightly more sophisticated approach than the ones in the orange bars. When it comes to mid-size and large companies, we see that, you know, they're a little bit more likely, in mid-sized company cases, much more likely to use data in that lower level. When it comes to the smaller companies, once they actually make the leap and use data, they appear to be a bit more agile, with actually half of them using it in that more sophisticated way to conduct analysis using trends of what has occurred to provide signals of what may occur. So, you know, it isn't all, you know, there is a certain sense when it comes to technology that if small companies can make the investments, they can also be more agile in the way that they're able to implement them. And then finally, we did do a case study on predictive analytics. And we saw that the Bolt company was using predictive analytics. I'm not going to go through all the bullet points here, but the benefits they saw worker compensation costs cut by 75% and a 10% reduction in their total accident rate. They talked about the importance of educating the workforce and how it's helpful because it gives them a big picture on safety. Rather than going from incident to incident to incident, they get a larger understanding of patterns that help them really manage safety better. And Scott Fraser in that last point says, our project teams are hungry to get a better understanding of the risks they face. All right, the last section we're going to talk about is health and wellness. And we did ask about the degree to which their companies are providing health and wellness programs to job site workers. And we see that most of them say, yes, we're providing, about half of the total industry says we're providing alcohol and substance abuse programs, but only about a third of small companies say that they're doing so. We see that when it comes to mental health services, about half of large companies are providing that, but only a quarter of the small companies are. And we see that a large percentage of the industry doesn't have access to any kind of stress management or smoking cessation programs. And I think this is really an area where the industry can help the individual companies to perhaps address these issues. We also wanted to understand COVID, right? There's been a lot of health-related things that were introduced due to COVID. So first we wanted to understand, well, what did you introduce? And you can see that widely used, those used by 50% or more, includes increased use of cloth-based coverings, enforced social distancing, increased hand washing stations, and required temperature checks. But I do want to actually, before I move on from this slide, point to the top practice in moderate use. Now, see, it almost made the list into the widely used practices, right? The cutoff was 50% and it was at 49%. Providing more flexible, tolerant policies for absenteeism due to illness. Now, this is kind of a major cultural shift for the construction industry that nearly half are saying, you know, we're looking at absenteeism a little bit differently and how it impacts productivity, that we'd rather someone stay home if they're really ill rather than get the entire crew sick. And when we ask them about what practices they plan to continue post-pandemic, it's great that hand washing stations, which are critical to health, are definitely included. Use of gloves has always been important on job sites. But third on this list is, again, that providing more flexible, tolerant policies for absenteeism. Yes, it's only 20% who say we think we're going to do this in the future, but still it's notable that this seems to be a little bit of a shift, a little bit more of a focus around the health and well-being of workers. So I'm going to just show the top findings slide, but I do want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'll just leave this up on the screen and I'm going to go back to Rick to see what kind of questions we have. Rick?
Yep, I'm here. Great, that was really terrific, Donna. Very comprehensive, and it's been a real pleasure working with you guys over the past almost 10 years now. We have received a few questions, and if anybody has one right now, feel free to type it in the chat or the Q&A. But here's one that came in. It's about the panel. Can you describe the panel that Dodge has, so that you administer the survey to, and how they engage them in completing the survey?
Sure. So
example, how many are part of the panel? Do they offer incentives, that sort of thing?
Sorry about that. Yes, so we have about over 2,000 contractors who've opted in. We used our initial Dodge contacts. Dodge has a great list of active contractors. So we have about 2,000 contractors who've opted in to say, yes, we will take surveys. And they are compensated when we do panel surveys. Any contractor who fills out a survey gets a $20 Amazon gift card, and anyone who fills out at least one survey gets entered into a bigger sweepstakes at the end of the year. So there is that. But again, they are people. Our panels are really interesting, though. They tend to be, which always surprises me. They really tend to be decision makers and either project leadership or firm leadership. That's the majority of the panel. We have about 20% estimators, and then the rest are either project managers or firm leadership. So we really do get some really great insights, and we do refresh the panels regularly so that we make sure that they're deeply engaged. But we make sure that the panels are balanced in terms of geographical representation. We're able to compare the degree of the share of contractors who are coming from it with the overall activity in Dodge to make sure that the panel makes sense and is very representative in that way. We're able to have, we make sure we have a good mix of size of companies, since we want to reflect the industry. While we have many large firms, the panel has quite a few small firms, because as you know, the construction industry largely made up of a lot of small firms. So we we do have very strong representation from small firms as well.
Is it fairly dynamic? Does it change year to year as far as
It's
numbers?
again, usually it's not year to year, but about every 2 years we refresh the panel. So
Okay.
we make sure that we send out new invitations. We always check to see who's active and who's not. That's part of the sweepstakes process too, right? You know, if you
Right.
have not participated in the entire year, you not only don't get invited into the sweepstakes, but we know that it's not worth sending it out to this person. So we do make sure that we do keep it very dynamic.
Okay, great. And that's related to another question that asked if the survey participants are primarily safety professionals. And
And
I guess the answer is no, right?
that is correct. We do have some safety professionals, and again, of course, remember that it wasn't just the panel that formed the basis of the survey respondents. It did go out through all those organizations, so we did get a lot of safety professionals through that too. But no, the majority of them, this is the perspective again, mostly of leadership in those organizations, either at the project or the firm level.
All right, great. Thank you. Here's another question. What separates the great safety performers in construction from the also-rans? I have to admit, I had to look up also-rans, but in short, it's the people who are the companies that are not the great performers. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, the only thought I have on that is, of course, you know, we're not trying to push our vision onto the industry, right? I mean, we do rely on CPWR's expertise to make sure we're asking about the right practices and everything like that. But we recognize that it's those who do it who really understand it. That's why we include that question, actually, on world-class safety program, because we ask the contractors themselves what distinguishes, you know, basically asking them what is in a world-class safety program is the same thing as asking, well, what distinguishes the really strong performers from those who are also RANs. And it's that they do a lot of the things that come out on top of that world-class safety program piece. And again, we do find consistently that there is a strong correlation. I showed it by size of firm because it does correlate in that way, but consistently across the different things, you can correlate that those who do a lot of safety, you know, really are engaged in safety and employing a lot of different practices, are seeing greater benefits from it. We have always seen that correlation.
Great. Okay. Here's a question that just came in. You may have answered this, but did smaller companies use health and COVID-related practices at the same rate as bigger companies, and do they plan to retain these practices at the same rate?
Oh, now this is interesting. I actually am not sure that I know the answer to that question off the top of my head. I'm sorry, but we might need to get the name of that person and email them back. I don't remember. We had a lot of practices to cover, so we might not have had enough space to just show the differences. I know the write-up in the report would definitely feature that if there were differences. I think that I'm sure there were some differences. I don't think they were as strong. With the health and safety practices, the ones I showed on the slide, that already showed the breakdown, and it was clearly larger companies who offered more mental health services, things like that. But when it came to the COVID stuff, I think there were I recall that there were practices that were more widely used by large companies than small, but there were a lot that weren't. So I would have to go back into the details to know which ones fell in which category.
Okay, good. This is a question about safety leadership, on how important is it to incorporate safety leadership and safety training? Are there many contractors interested in doing it? And I think I could take a stab at answering that. And the bottom line is that without safety leadership from frontline crew leaders such as foremen, general foremen, superintendents, it doesn't really matter how many safety policies you put in place if the leaders aren't leading by example to create a strong, positive safety climate or culture. You won't get the desired safety outcome. And as far as the evidence that we have at CPWR with the Foundations for Safety Leadership, the answer is yes. Many contractors in the U.S. and actually across the world are using the FSL, and it's becoming quite popular. I think we have time for one more question. So do you have any ideas what drives the use of new technologies?
That's an interesting question. We have done a lot of other research with contractors, not related to the study, but on that topic. And often it's productivity. Another thing that's really critical to contractors is usability. They do not have the bandwidth to go through a huge change management process, to go through a huge training process on technology. If they're interested in technologies, they have to be technologies that they can pick up and have, be intuitive enough that their people on site will use them. You can have the greatest technology in the world, but if you don't get buy-in from your workers to use it, it doesn't do you any good. And so most contractors do put a high premium on immediate usability.
Right, good answer. All right, well, I think we're going to wrap up. We're at the hour, and I really want to thank you again, Donna. It was a fantastic presentation. Thanks to all the participants that tuned in, and again, this will be it's been recorded, so it'll be on our YouTube channel, and if anybody wants to have a look at it or send it to others, hope you do. So with that, thank you. Thank you, Jessica, as well.
All right. Thank you, Rick. It's always a pleasure to work with CPWR.
All right. Bye-bye.